Thank you, Jeet Thayil, for joining us at the Faber offices to discuss your book, Narcopolis. I mean, one of the things that most people notice when they pick up Narcopolis for the first time is that the first sentence of the book goes on for 7 pages, which is an unusual thing. What made you begin the novel that way, and did that part of the book come first, or is that something that came later when you were constructing the novel?
It came much later. It came about halfway through the writing of the novel. And it came sort of like how poems come, which is unlike the way novels arrive. And it's, you follow where the burst leads with enthusiasm and kind of joy. And that's how this thing happened. And I wrote it, I think, over a few days. And as I finished it, I realized that this was the style of the book, that this was the voice of the book. And of course, that a book about opium, and a book that at points approximates the opiated or opiatic state, would have long sentences rather than short ones, would have open-ended, dreamy sentences that you get, as a reader, you get the sense that the author had no idea where it would end up, and which gives it a kind of a spontaneity and a feel of improvisation. So when I wrote the first sentence, the prologue, I realized this was that I'd hit on the note for the book, and I then rewrote the entire book.
Because it is an unusual kind of patchwork and interlacement of different voices, different styles. Was that always the way that you envisioned the book being, or was that just taken in context after hitting on the long sentence which started the book?
Well, I'm not one of those guys who knows before commencing work exactly how the story is going to go, and beginning, middle, end, and all of that, and then you just fill in the words. I discovered it as I was writing it, and I think that may be one reason why it took so long. And I would keep coming back to it. It took over 5 years, and I would keep coming back to it, and I think it kind of gave it layers and levels that I had no idea would be there. And I knew that the prologue and other parts of the book would be in the first person, would have a strong I voice. But I also knew that many parts of it would be in the third person. At first I didn't know how to reconcile those two points of view, but then I realized you can do that. That's why a novel is called a novel. You can approach it in a novel way. And that's why the death of the novel is always it's a magazine headline, and it's something that novelists like to talk about because they know it's never going to happen.
Yeah. How much of Bombay came from your physical experience of you being there, and how much it became a kind of an artistic impression of a particular city?
Well, I started writing this book in Delhi,
Right.
and then moved to Bangalore, and ended it in Bombay. I was living in Bombay when I was writing about it, when I finished it. And I was living in Bandra, and parts of the book are set in Bandra. But I was describing a city that didn't exist at that point. It was a Bombay that had unraveled years ago, years before. And I think at the end of the book you do get a sense of the new Bombay, which is a far hairier place in many ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was interested because one of the dangers about writing any kind of any narrative which involves drugs is that there is the ability to glamorize drug use. Were you conscious of trying not to fall into that kind of novelistic trap of glamorizing?
Yeah, of course, yeah. And also, just by the nature of the subject, I think it was very clear that that was a risk that would be difficult to run. Yeah. I was asked at a reading once whether this book would turn young readers to drugs. I read drug literature as a young person, and although I don't think it was glamorized in any way, the kind of books I read. And if a book can drive you to drugs, I think the weather could.
Yeah, that's certainly true. In terms of just thinking about the literature of drugs, and just to touch on that briefly, do you think that there is a kind of pressure on any novel that features drugs to be authentic, to have a kind of ring of authenticity, which means that, you know, if you're interviewed, then you've got to be able to say, well, I did take drugs in, you know, in these kind of opium dens or whatever it is. Do you think there's a pressure on writers to have to conform to that?
Well, it's interesting that the books that we think of as the, you know, the pantheon of drug literature are by people who have been victims of and denizens of the world that they're describing. And I think, you know, I tried very hard not to write the drug book because, you know, we've read those books,
Yeah.
and I didn't want to be self-indulgent. So I tried to use the years in which I'd been part of that world. I tried to use those years for journalistic detail more than anything else.
If I was to describe Narcopolis, I'd describe it as a novel in voices and stories where people come and go, and, you know, as they would do in any kind of major city, but because you've got a kind of a hub by which they can float through. But the one particular bit which I was very interested in was the narrative strand which takes you away from Bombay and takes you out to China, because that's a bold move for a book which Bombay is a central character.
Yeah.
What made you decide to take this deviated route out of Bombay?
The Chinese section was criticized a lot, and it baffled me because I thought I was writing a kind of a Russian novel in which the Russians, they invented the digression. There would be a digression on the nature of God, which would go on for 30 pages. And 10 pages into it, you would think this is absolutely insane. And of course, if it's Dostoevsky, it would be insane.
Yeah.
But the thing is that you would come back then to the main storyline, and it would be much richer because of that digression.
Yeah.
And this is something a Russian novel does many times in the course of a book, you know, and
Yeah.
I loved it. I loved that kind of improvised nature, the spontaneous improvised nature it was like jazz music of those digressions. But that said, this digression was actually also absolutely justifiable in the sense that if you're writing a book about opium in India, in Bombay, there's no way you can ignore what the Chinese aspect of it, because in Bombay changed from a collection of 7 uninhabitable malarial islands between 1800 and 1840, 40 years, was transformed from this absolutely unlivable place into the great metropolis and the great financial capital of India, which it still is, because the East India Company and a handful of Parsi ship owners shipped hundreds of tons of opium to China over those 4 years and made a lot of money. And at that point, the East India Company was the world's largest drug pusher. And like pushers anywhere in the world, they were incredibly brutal as well during those 4 years. And it transformed the fortunes of Bombay. So today there are a lot of hospitals, colleges, roads named after them, and people have no idea where that fortune was built on. And the history books that talk about those years very conveniently omit the fact of opium. You know. So I was lucky that I'd grown up in Hong Kong. I lived there right through the 70s. I knew Chinese culture in a way, by accident. And, you know, I knew a lot of the language. I knew the curse words, and I wanted to use all of that.
Yeah.
So it was a way to use what I knew about the Chinese and bring that into a story. And I think it's absolutely, of course, I mean, you know, the title of that section tells you this is the story of the pipe.
Yeah.
So I think it's you know, in a way, I think it's a conventional bit of structure.
I guess that's a great way to leave it then. Thank you very much,
Oh,
Jeet
my
Thayil.
pleasure.
Cheers.